He didn't knock. He never knocked. Detective Garrett Hale kicked the door open at 2 in the morning, and the first thing he did was grab Elena by the throat. Not because she'd done anything wrong. Not because she'd run. Because she dared to exist somewhere he hadn't given her permission to be. She clawed at his fingers. He smiled. That smile. Flat, satisfied. The kind that belongs on a man who's learned he can hurt someone and face zero consequences. That smile is where this story truly begins. Because Elena Voss had spent 14 months building a life out of silence and borrowed time, and in 30 seconds Garrett dismantled all of it. But she wasn't alone that night. She just didn't know it yet. If you've ever had to disappear to stay alive, if you've ever changed your name, your hair, your whole identity just to sleep without one eye open, then you already understand Elena before I say another word. And if you haven't, I want you to ask yourself something. What would you have done the night a bleeding stranger crashed through your window and the man hunting you was already at the door? Hit the like button if that question unsettles you. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay close, because I promise you, what happens over the next 5 parts will not let you go. Now let's go back to the beginning, the real beginning. What? Elena Voss had been working the overnight trauma shift at Mercy General for 11 months when she started to believe, cautiously and against every instinct she'd developed, that she might actually be safe, not healed. She wasn't stupid enough to use that word. Her hand still shook sometimes when a man raised his voice in the ER hallway. She still checked the locks twice before climbing into bed, then got up and checked them a 3rd time. She kept a prepaid phone behind the loose baseboard under her kitchen sink, wrapped in a rubber band with $300 cash. Old habit. Emergency exit fund. The kind of thing you stop needing when your life is normal, and the kind of thing you never stop keeping when it isn't. Her name wasn't actually Elena Voss. It had been Elena Marsh once, before Garrett. She'd changed it legally 18 months ago, inside a courthouse in a mid-sized city 2 states away from the one where Garrett Hale still pinned his detective shield every morning and walked into the Chicago PD building like he owned the floor beneath his feet. She'd changed her hair from dark brown to the kind of dishwater blonde that made you forgettable. She'd given up her apartment, her credit history, her sister's phone number, her gym, her therapist, 3 good friendships, and a job she'd loved. She had given up almost everything she was because Garrett Hale had made very clear that continuing to be Elena Marsh would eventually cost her everything she had left. She had filed the reports. That part she needed people to understand because sometimes strangers assumed she hadn't tried, that she'd just run without attempting the official channels first. She had filed 3 separate reports over 8 months. The first officer who took her statement had known Garrett personally and spent the entire interview looking past her left shoulder. The second report had vanished from the system entirely. The third had resulted in a formal internal review that lasted 6 weeks and concluded with Garrett receiving a private reprimand and a new commendation for community outreach. After that, she'd packed 1 bag and disappeared. Chicago had been a calculated choice, large enough to vanish in. Busy enough that no one noticed a quiet nurse who kept odd hours and didn't socialize much. She'd taken a room in a 3rd-floor walk-up apartment building in Pilsen, an old brick building with loud pipes and a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived cash in the envelope on the 1st of the month. She paid 2 months ahead every time. The landlord had never once learned her first name. She worked nights. She told her coworkers she was introverted. She told herself this was temporary, that eventually she would find a way to live like a person again, instead of a file that had been misfiled and was better off staying lost. That was the life she had built. It was small and anxious, and it belonged entirely to her. And on the night of November 14th, she was 22 minutes from the end of her shift and thinking about nothing more dramatic than whether she had enough coffee at home to get her through the following afternoon when the radio at the nurse's station crackled with an incoming alert. Multiple gunshot victims. Coordinated attack on a private vehicle convoy. 2 confirmed critical. ETA 4 minutes. Elena pulled on fresh gloves and stopped thinking about coffee. She didn't make it home until almost 6 in the morning. By the time she climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment, her scrubs had a rust-colored smear across the left sleeve that the hospital's industrial wash wouldn't entirely remove, and her feet ached in the specific bone-deep way that only came after a shift where you never once sat down. She had saved 2 lives that night. She had also lost one, a young man who'd arrived with wounds too catastrophic to reverse no matter how fast or how skilled her hands were. She had stood back from the table after 16 minutes and felt that specific hollow feeling that never quite became familiar no matter how many times she experienced it. She keyed her locks, deadbolt first, then the secondary chain she'd installed herself 3 weeks after moving in, and stepped inside without turning on the overhead light. Old habit. Ground floor apartments across the alley sometimes had people who looked up at lit windows. Third floor was safer, but the habit stuck. She had just reached the kitchen when she heard it. Not footsteps. Not a voice. Something heavier. A wet, dragging sound from the direction of the window that faced the rear of the building. Elena went absolutely still. The window was already open 2 inches. She never left it open. She had not left it open. She reached for the counter without turning around, fingers finding the handle of the chef's knife she kept in the wooden block beside the stove. Not because she cooked elaborately. Because Garrett had once told her, while gripping her wrist so hard the bruise lasted 10 days, that she was the kind of person who could be found anywhere, and she had believed him. She turned slowly. The man was half inside and half outside her window, one arm hooked over the sill, the other pressed flat against his own abdomen. I was wearing what had once been an extremely expensive charcoal suit. What it was now was a wreck, torn at the shoulder, soaked through in dark patches that weren't rain, though the rain outside was coming down hard enough that she could hear it against the fire escape grating. His face was angled down and she couldn't see it clearly, only the sharp line of his jaw, and the way it was clenched so hard the muscle jumped beneath the skin. He was trying not to make noise. She could see that. He was losing the effort. "Don't," he said. His voice was low and controlled, but she could hear what was underneath the control, the effort it cost him to keep breathing steadily. "Don't scream." Elena hadn't screamed. She was still holding the knife. "You're bleeding," she said, which was not the most sophisticated observation she'd ever made, but it was the accurate one. "I'm aware." He shifted his weight, and a sound escaped him that he'd clearly been working to prevent, a sharp, bitten-off exhale that told her more than anything else how bad it was. He managed to get his second leg over the sill and landed in a crouch on her kitchen floor that immediately became something closer to a collapse, one hand catching him against the linoleum. Elena stood 6 feet away and did what any rational person would have done in that moment, which was to calculate very rapidly whether the man in her kitchen constituted more of a threat or more of a crisis. He was large, not just tall, but the kind of large that came from deliberate, sustained physical development, broad through the shoulders. The suit had been tailored to fit that frame, and it still wasn't managing particularly well. Under better circumstances, he would have been what her coworkers would have described as formidably attractive. Right now, he was pale beneath his olive complexion, sweating through expensive fabric, and losing blood at a rate that told her she was looking at somewhere between a 20 and 40-minute window depending on the source. "How many?" she asked. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark, almost black in the low light, and more alert than they had any right to be given his condition. He was reading her. She could feel it, assessing her in the same way she was assessing him, filing information, deciding. "How many what?" "Wounds." A pause. "2. Maybe 3. He glanced down at himself with a brief expression of what she could only describe as professional dissatisfaction. "The one on the left side of the abdomen is the problem." "I need light," she said. "The people who did this will be within 3 blocks in approximately." He stopped, breathed through his nose, continued. 8 minutes. "Then we move fast. Can you get to the bathroom?" "I can get wherever I need to get." "Bathroom," she said. "Now. Stay low." She didn't wait for him to argue. She went ahead of him, keeping the lights off, navigating by memory and the gray urban glow that came through the frosted bathroom window. She heard him following, unsteady, but moving, which meant functional. She pulled the bathroom door shut behind them both, and only then, with the small room's single wall between them and any window facing the alley, did she click on the light above the mirror. She had a full second to look at him clearly before she reached for her kit. I was younger than she'd thought, somewhere in his mid-30s, though the set of his face carried the kind of compressed weight that aged a person in ways that had nothing to do with years. The suit up close was extraordinary, even ruined, the kind of thing that came from a specific address in a specific city and cost more than she made in 2 months. His hands, she noticed, were damaged in a particular way, knuckles that had been broken and healed repeatedly, the kind of hands that told a story about sustained violence as an occupational reality rather than an exception. He sat down on the edge of the tub with the deliberate care of a man managing pain through sheer determined refusal to let it show. "You're a nurse," he said. "What gave it away?" "The way you looked at me." He watched her pull open the cabinet beneath the sink where she kept, alongside the standard household items, a medical kit that went significantly beyond what most private citizens maintained. Compression bandages, surgical tape, a sealed suture kit she'd obtained through channels her ER supervisor didn't know about, lidocaine, irrigation syringes. Most people see a wound and they panic or they freeze. You looked at me like a problem with a solution. "Take off the jacket." He did, and the shirt beneath it, with the kind of grim efficiency that confirmed her initial read. He'd done this before, or something close enough to it. The damage was worse than he'd described, though she had a feeling he'd known that and chosen to understate it. The left side abdominal wound was deep and still actively bleeding through the compress he'd fashioned from what appeared to be his own pocket square. The second wound was a graze along his right upper arm, ugly but manageable. The third, which he'd categorized as a maybe, was a puncture high on the left shoulder that had partially clotted on its own. "I'm going to irrigate and pack the abdominal wound first," she said. "This is going to hurt considerably. Do what you need to do." "I don't have adequate anesthesia." "I know." He braced his forearm against the tub ledge. "Do it." She did. He made one sound. One. A single sharp intake of breath when she irrigated the wound with saline, and then he went somewhere very far away behind his eyes and stayed there while she worked. Not unconscious. She checked periodically, just absent. Present enough to remain still and useful, gone enough to manage what she was doing to him. It was a discipline she'd seen occasionally in patients with military backgrounds or certain kinds of sustained occupational trauma. The ability to divide the mind from the body's immediate experience. She packed and sutured in silence for 11 minutes. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. The rain continued outside. She was tying off the final closure on the abdominal wound when they both heard it at the same time. Footsteps in the hallway. Multiple sets. Moving with the specific cadence of people trying to be quiet and not quite achieving it. The man's eyes, which had been fixed at a middle distance, snapped to her face. "Back door to the alley," he said quietly. "Stairwell at the end of the hall. 3 flights. "Is there anywhere in this apartment?" She had already thought of it. "Under the bed. Don't argue. You cannot run in this condition." He opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved across his face that she thought might have been, under different circumstances, amusement. You give orders like someone who's used to being ignored and doesn't intend to tolerate it. Get under the bed. She helped him, more than she expected to need to, because the blood loss was catching up with him faster than he was willing to admit. She got him situated, pulled the bed frame's low clearance tight against his form, and spread the dust ruffle. She had a dust ruffle, an inheritance from the apartment's previous tenant, and she had never once been grateful for it until this exact moment, flat across the floor. Then she went to the door. 3 knocks. Hard, official. The knock of someone who believed the door belonged to them. Elena looked through the peephole. 2 men in uniform, CPD, but something about the way they stood was wrong. Not relaxed, not the practiced casual of patrol officers doing a welfare check. Coiled, pointed, like they already knew what they were looking for. She unhooked the chain, left the deadbolt on. She opened the door 2 inches. "Can I help you?" "Sorry to bother you, ma'am." The officer in front was young and too good-looking in the way that sometimes indicated nothing and sometimes indicated someone who'd learned early that the face was an asset to exploit. "We're responding to a report of a disturbance in the building. You heard anything unusual in the last hour?" "I just got home from a 12-hour shift," she said, which was true. "I barely heard my own alarm." "You mind if we take a look around?" "I mind very much," she said. "You have a warrant?" A pause. The 2 officers exchanged something with their eyes. "No, ma'am. We'd just like to—" "Then good night." She closed the door, engaged the chain, stood with her back flat against the wood, and her heart doing something percussive and unmanageable behind her ribs, and listened to the footsteps eventually, after a long pause, move away down the hallway. She counted to 60 before she went back to the bedroom. She lifted the dust ruffle. He was looking up at her from the floor beneath her bed. Not rattled, not grateful exactly, though something in his expression had shifted in a way she couldn't entirely categorize. He looked like a man recalibrating something. "They weren't real CPD," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "They weren't. Who are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she almost repeated the question. "Lucien Moretti." The name landed. She didn't know it, not specifically, not the way someone who moved in different circles might have recognized it instantly, but she felt the weight it carried. Names said like that, with that particular flat certainty, were not names people introduced themselves by when they were hoping to make a positive impression. They were names that came with a room's worth of implication attached. "And who are those men?" "Former associates," he said. The word former is doing considerable work in that sentence. "Are there more of them?" "Yes." "Coming here?" "Within the hour, probably. I need to move." He shifted, and the sound he made told her everything about how well moving was going to go. You need to stay still for another 15 minutes, or you'll tear the sutures I just spent the last half hour placing," she said. "And then you'll bleed out on my floor, and the men looking for you will find exactly what they're looking for, so the whole exercise will have been pointless." Silence. 15 minutes, he said. 15. She sat on the edge of the bed above him and listened to the building breathe around them, to the rain, to the distant sound of traffic on the elevated tracks 3 blocks west. She was still wearing her scrubs with the rust-colored stain on the sleeve. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the middle of the suturing, and she wasn't sure exactly when. "Why didn't you turn me in?" he asked from the floor. She thought about it. It was a legitimate question, and it deserved something better than deflection. "The men at the door didn't feel like protection," she said finally. "They felt like the other thing." Another silence. "I know the difference," she added, and left it at that. She didn't tell him about Garrett. There was no reason to tell him about Garrett. She had spent 14 months not telling anyone about Garrett, because telling people about Garrett was how you ended up with commendations for community outreach, showing up in his personnel file in rust-colored sleeve stains that were your own instead of someone else's. When 12 minutes had passed, not 15 she noted, but close enough that she decided not to argue, Lucien Moretti pulled himself out from under her bed with a controlled slowness that told her he was applying everything he had to making it look easier than it was. She helped him to the window. He paused there, one hand braced on the sill, the other pressed carefully against the left side of his abdomen. He looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light coming in from outside. Really looked at her. Not the assessing look from before, not the calculation. Something else. Like he was trying to memorize something he didn't expect to see again. "You have a name," he said. "Elena." He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something. "Elena." He said it with the specific weight of someone filing it somewhere important. "Anyone comes after you, anyone at all." He held her gaze. "They come through me first." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure what the right answer was. He went out the window and down the fire escape without another word, moving with a careful, deliberate economy that was almost graceful despite everything, and within 30 seconds the darkness below had absorbed him entirely. Elena stood at the window for a long time after he was gone. The rain was still falling. Her apartment was quiet. There was blood on her bathroom floor that she needed to clean before morning, and a broken window latch she needed to fix, and a story she would need to decide whether she believed or not. She went to the bathroom. She cleaned the floor. She did not, even for 1 second, consider calling the police. She scrubbed the bathroom floor on her hands and knees for 20 minutes. Not because she was afraid of evidence. She wasn't thinking in those terms yet. Or maybe she was and refused to acknowledge it. She scrubbed because the physical act of it gave her somewhere to put the adrenaline that had no other exit. The brush moved in hard circles across the tile grout, and she focused on that, only that, the resistance of the bristles and the smell of the bleach solution, until the floor was clean enough to satisfy whatever part of her brain was currently running the operation. She stood up. Her knees ached. She was still in her scrubs. She went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank half of it, and stood at the sink looking at the window he'd come through. The latch was bent, not broken all the way. Bent, torqued sideways by the weight of someone climbing through it in a hurry. She could jury-rig it tonight, replace it properly over the weekend. She filed that under the category of problems with practical solutions, because that category was the only one she trusted herself to manage right now. The other category, the one that contained a man named Lucien Moretti and a set of promises made through a rain-dark window by someone who bled through a $3,000 suit without complaint. That category she left alone. She changed out of the scrubs. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the kitchen window with the second half of her water glass and watched the alley below go from black to gray to the particular washed-out pale that meant morning had officially arrived, and she thought about the face of the officer who'd knocked on her door. The too smooth face, the eyes that had moved past her into the apartment with a quick, practiced inventory that had nothing to do with a welfare check. She'd seen that look before. It lived in a different city and wore a different face, but she knew it. By 7 in the morning, she had convinced herself that Lucien Moretti was gone, that whatever world he occupied had reabsorbed him, and that the most dangerous thing she needed to worry about was the bent window latch. She was wrong about all three. It took 4 days before she noticed the first one. He was standing on the corner of the block when she left for her shift on Tuesday evening, an average-looking man in an unremarkable jacket, doing nothing in particular with the committed purposelessness of someone who'd been told to stand there and look like he wasn't standing there. She wouldn't have clocked him at all except that he was there again Wednesday morning when she came home, in a different position, different jacket, but with the same particular quality of attention, present without being directed at anything, like a camera set to wide angle. She walked past him without changing her pace, went upstairs, stood inside her door with her pulse climbing, and ran the math. He wasn't Garrett's. Garrett's people had a specific texture. They were sloppy in the way that people with institutional backing got sloppy, overconfident, never quite believing that the person they were watching would recognize what they were seeing. This man was different, disciplined, almost invisible, which meant he'd been trained by someone who valued invisibility, which meant he was Moretti's. She pulled out her phone. She didn't have a number for him. Obviously, she didn't have a number for him. She put the phone back down and stood in her kitchen feeling something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief and was deeply uncomfortable in the way that things are when they refuse to be categorized cleanly. 2 days later, there was a different man on the corner. A week after that, a woman, middle-aged, ordinary, reading something on her phone with the kind of relaxed performance that confirmed she hadn't read a single word of it. Elena stopped counting after that. They were always there. She just stopped looking. What she told herself was that it didn't change anything. What she actually felt at 3 in the morning when the building settled and made sounds that sent her hand moving toward the knife block before she was fully conscious was something she couldn't quite name. Not safe. She wasn't naive enough to call it that, but something adjacent to it. Something that made her chest feel marginally less like a fist clenched around itself at all hours. She hated that she noticed. She hated more that it helped. 41 days after the night. He'd come through her window. Lucien Moretti walked into the emergency department at Mercy General. Not as a patient. He was dressed as though the concept of emergency had been surgically removed from his life. Charcoal trousers, a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms. The kind of effortless presentation that cost significant money and more significant attention. He stood at the nurse's station with the particular stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to command a room's attention. Elena saw him from the far end of the corridor. She didn't stop walking. She adjusted her pace to something deliberate and unhurried and covered the distance between them in approximately 15 seconds, which was enough time to construct an expression that communicated clearly that she was not pleased. "You can't be here," she said. "I needed to confirm you were all right. You've had people watching me for 6 weeks." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She doubted guilt was a frequent visitor to whatever emotional landscape Lucien Moretti maintained, but something like recalibration. He hadn't expected her to know. Or perhaps he'd expected her to know and hadn't expected her to say it this directly. "Yes," he said, without asking me. "Yes." "Take them off." "No." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with a steadiness that was its own kind of pressure. Not aggressive, not manipulative, just immovable. The look of someone who had arrived at a position through reasoning he considered thorough and complete and had no intention of reopening the discussion. You nearly died on my bathroom floor, she said, keeping her voice low. The ER around them was its usual controlled chaos, and no one was paying attention to two people having a quiet conversation by the supply room door. But she was acutely conscious of the badge clipped to her lanyard and the fact that this was her professional world, and he was standing in the middle of it like a stone dropped in a pond. And then you left. That was the agreement. We didn't make an agreement. The implied agreement. I made you a promise, he said. I keep mine. I didn't ask for the promise. No. He paused. You also didn't ask for the trouble that followed you here from wherever you were before. That's not a judgment. It's a fact I've had to account for. Elena felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. Not literally, just the internal equivalent of a ground that she'd believed was solid, revealing a different quality than advertised. What do you know about where I was before? She said carefully. Garrett Hale, he said. Just that. The name and nothing else, delivered with the same flatness she imagined he used for balance sheets and body counts. The supply room door was 3 feet behind her. She didn't move toward it. She didn't move at all. How? I looked, he said. After. When I was in a position to look. You had no right. The man has been accessing records, Lucian said, and his voice dropped a register, not softer but more compressed, like something bringing its full weight to bear. Not just old ones, current ones. He ran a query on your nursing license 14 days ago. He has your address, Elena. Maybe not the right apartment, not yet, but he has the building. She heard her own breathing in a way she usually didn't. He's been here, she said, not a question. She was already running it backward in her memory, mapping the last 2 weeks. The car that had been parked across the street 3 mornings in a row. The man in the coffee shop near the hospital, who'd looked at her 2 seconds longer than casual. The feeling, which she'd dismissed as paranoia, which she'd scolded herself for, which she'd filed under old fear wearing new clothes, of being watched from a different direction than the one she'd learned to recognize. Not at your door, Lucian said. Not yet. Not yet. No. She exhaled. It was not a calm exhale. It was the kind of exhale that preceded a very fundamental restructuring of assumptions, and it took effort to keep it contained enough that the triage nurse 20 feet away didn't look up. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you'd want to know. How do you know what I... She stopped, started again. You don't know me. I know he said, without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. I know you checked your exits when I walked in just now. I know you moved your purse to the locker room at the start of your shift because there's nothing in it you'd be willing to leave behind in a hurry. I know the latch on your window is new. A beat. You installed it yourself, slightly crooked, functional but crooked. Elena stared at him. I'm not surveilling your apartment, he said, and had the self-awareness to sound like he understood the distinction was not particularly reassuring in context. One of my people noticed when they checked the building perimeter. It's their job to notice. I need you to leave, she said. Elena, I need you to leave this building right now, and I need to think, and I cannot do either of those things while you're standing in front of me telling me that the man I moved 2 states to get away from has my address. She held his gaze. Please. The please cost her something. She could feel it leaving. Lucian looked at her for a long moment, that same measuring look, that same quality of filing things away in somewhere deep and permanent. And then he nodded once. My number, he said, and held out a card. A plain card, no name on it, just 11 digits handwritten in ink so dark it was almost black. She took it. He left. She stood in the corridor for 30 seconds and then went into the supply room, closed the door, and sat down on an overturned equipment crate and put her head in her hands and stayed there until her breathing was her own again. Garrett Hale found her building on a Thursday. She knew he was there before she saw him, the way you know certain things that live below the level of conscious thought. She was coming home from the morning shift, coffee in her left hand, keys in her right, and she rounded the corner onto her block and something in her body recognized the black sedan before her brain processed it. Her stride hitched, just barely, just for 1 step, and then she smoothed it out and kept walking because stopping was worse than continuing, and she'd learned that much. She went past the building entrance, kept going to the corner, turned. stood with her back against the brick, and pressed her thumb against the edge of her key until the small physical pain gave her somewhere specific to put her attention. The sedan was a rental. Illinois plates, but the kind of plates that came from airport kiosks. She'd seen the silhouette in the driver's seat, relaxed, patient. The posture of a man who had done a great deal of waiting and knew that waiting almost always produced results if you were willing to be the more stubborn party. Garrett had always been willing to be the more stubborn party. She walked 2 blocks north, ducked into a laundromat, and called Lucian's number from behind a row of industrial dryers. He picked up on the second ring. "He's outside," she said. No pause. "Where are you?" She told him. "Stay there." His voice was the same as it had been in her ER hallway, compressed, weighted, already somewhere several steps ahead of the current moment. "Don't go back to the building. I'm sending someone to you in 8 minutes. I'm not—" She stopped, restarted. "I don't want your people escorting me around, Lucien. 8 minutes. I said, he has a weapon," Lucien said. "He's been carrying off duty for weeks. Not his service weapon, a different one, unregistered." A pause that felt like the inside of something very quiet and very cold. "Stay in the laundromat." She stayed in the laundromat. The woman who arrived 7 minutes and 50 seconds later was not what Elena had expected, though she couldn't have articulated precisely what she had expected. Mid-40s, compact and unremarkable in the way that clearly took effort to achieve. She had the kind of face that a room forgot 30 seconds after she left it. She sat down next to Elena on the bench between the dryers without introducing herself and said quietly, "Car's in the back alley. We'll go out through the service entrance. I'm not leaving without my things." "Your things are already being moved." Elena turned to look at her. "Excuse me?" "The important ones. Documents. The kit under your sink. The phone." The woman met her gaze with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely definitive. "We've had a bag staged for 3 weeks in case of exactly this." The laundromat smelled like detergent and warm lint. 2 machines down, someone's clothing tumbled in a slow, hypnotic circle. Elena sat very still and processed what it meant that these people had known what was under her sink, had known about the prepaid phone, had prepared for this contingency before she'd even fully admitted to herself that the contingency existed. "He's watching the front of my building," she said finally. "I know." "What happens to him?" "Right now, nothing." The woman stood. "He can sit in that car as long as he wants. He's watching an empty building. Come on." Lucian's estate was not what she'd pictured, which meant she'd been picturing it, which irritated her. It sat north of the city proper on a peninsula that jutted into Lake Michigan, separated from the nearest residential neighborhood by a quarter-mile of tree line and a gate that appeared simple and wasn't. The house itself was large without being ostentatious, stone and dark timber, the kind of architecture that said endurance rather than display. The lake was visible from every north-facing window, gray and choppy in the November light. He met her in the front hall. She walked past him to the window overlooking the lake and stood there for a moment with her arms crossed. "You went through my apartment," she said. "My people went through your apartment. Efficiently and carefully. Nothing is missing or damaged. That's not the point." "No." He stopped a few feet behind her. She could see his reflection faintly in the glass, slightly angled, watching her back. "The point is that you're safe. We can address the procedural objections once the immediate threat is neutralized. You don't get to sequence my objections for me." "You're right." He said it without hesitation, which surprised her enough that she turned around. He looked, in the gray afternoon light of his own house, less like the controlled, compressed figure from the hospital corridor, and more like someone who was managing several simultaneous pressures and doing it by sheer force of structure. He also, she noticed, was holding himself slightly differently, a careful, almost imperceptible protection of his left side, the sutured side. "Are you still healing correctly?" she asked. "Yes." "You'd tell me if you weren't?" A brief pause. "Probably not." "Take your shirt off." He looked at her. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Shirt off." The sutures had held. That was the main thing. There was some superficial inflammation at the wound margin that she didn't love, and he had clearly been doing more physical activity than the recovery timeline warranted, which she told him in specific terms. He sat on the edge of a chair in what appeared to be a study. Bookshelves, a heavy desk, the particular organized clutter of someone who worked intensely and alone, and let her examine him without argument, which was its own kind of information. Garrett Hale has been a detective for 14 years, Lucian said while she worked. He's had 4 formal complaints filed against him, all 4 resolved in his favor. He has had a clearance rate that protected him from departmental scrutiny. He's also been on Arkady Volkov's informal payroll for approximately 3 of those 14 years. Elena's hand stilled. Volkov, she said, a rival organization. We have history. He said it with the flatness of a man describing a geological feature. Hale provides intelligence on CPD operations in exchange for money and protection. He's done it long enough that the relationship has solidified. Volkov considers him an asset. A pause. Which means Hale coming after you is no longer a domestic matter. It's become something with additional dimensions. She finished the examination and stepped back. You're telling me that my abusive ex-fiancé has accidentally become part of a criminal power struggle. Not accidentally. Hale went looking for resources after his formal power, his badge, his institutional backing, wasn't enough to find you. He went to someone who could provide the kind of off-books assistance he needed. That's a transaction. Transactions create relationships. His eyes met hers directly. Volkov knows about you now. Not as a person, as a pressure point, a way to destabilize me. You, she said. This is about you. Partially. He found me because of you. He found the building because of his own persistence, Lucian said carefully. The additional resources that made it faster, those came from a relationship he built before he knew I existed. I didn't bring him to your door, Elena. I'm telling you what brought him there, and why removing him is now more complicated than a single conversation. She sat down in the chair across from him. The lake was visible through the window behind his shoulder, dark and restless. What does removing him mean? She said. It means making certain he cannot reach you, ever. I'm asking what that looks like. He held her gaze. What would you like it to look like? It was the last thing she'd expected him to say. She'd expected deflection, or a version of the truth designed to be palatable. Not the question handed back to her, clean and direct. I want him to lose everything, she said. Not dead, not a martyr. I want him to lose his badge, his reputation, his access. I want him to be the person people look at the way he made me feel looked at. She paused. Can you do that? I've been building toward it for 5 weeks, he said. Outside, the lake threw itself against the stone. Inside the building, somewhere in the west wing, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the hallway. Footsteps, rapid and graceless. Then a voice, male, young, taut with something that wasn't quite panic but was in the same county, called Lucian's name. He was on his feet before the echo died. Elena followed him into the corridor. A man she didn't recognize stood at the far end, barely 25, with the particular tension of someone delivering news they knew would change the shape of the room. Volkov moved up the timeline, the young man said, breathing like he'd been running. 3 hours ago. He's not waiting for you to come to him. He looked at Elena, then back at Lucian. He offered Hale something new, not money. He swallowed. He offered to deliver her. In exchange for operational intelligence that Hale's been sitting on, Hale took the deal. The corridor was very quiet. Lucien turned to look at Elena. The thing in his expression was not panic. She didn't think panic was something his face knew how to construct. But it was the closest adjacent thing. A recognition that a situation previously in motion had just shifted into something that required an entirely different quality of response. Elena looked back at him. How long do we have? She asked. Lucian looked at the young man. The young man said, He was at your building an hour ago, and it was empty. He knows it's empty now. He'll start looking for where she went. A pause. He's going to figure it out. The estate around them was suddenly not a sanctuary. It was a location, a findable, addressable, attackable location. Lucien pulled his phone from his pocket. He made one call, said 4 words that Elena didn't catch, and ended it. Then he turned to her with the expression of a man who had been navigating dangerous situations for a long time and had reached a threshold he didn't cross lightly. You're not going to like what happens next, he said. I haven't liked anything that's happened in the last 6 weeks, she said. This is different. He held her gaze. This stops being something I can manage quietly. The young man at the end of the corridor checked his phone, looked up, and said, with a voice that had gone very flat, "He's already on the road." Elena heard her own pulse in her ears, steady and very loud, and thought, there it is. There it is, part 2. Kịch bản này được triển khai với dung lượng mục tiêu 4 trình in 5 bản chế tử, bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 1. Yêu cầu tập trung hoàn toàn vào cấu trúc mâu thuẫn leo thang. Các mâu thuẫn nội bộ giữa các nhân vật phải bùng nổ, sự nghi ngờ tăng cao và những sai lầm trong quá khứ bắt đầu để lại hậu quả. Duy trì giọng văn Mỹ thô ráp, giàu cảm xúc, không sáo rộng. Hãy kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tập trung vào những phản ứng bản năng nhất của con người. Hơi thở dồn dập, những cái nhìn đầy sát khí và sự mệt mỏi, rệu rã. Hội thoại phải chiếm ưu thế, mang tính đối đầu gay gắt, gãy gọn, không triết lý suông. Đảm bảo liên tục xuất hiện cú twist hấp dẫn theo mạch truyền để gây sự tò mò, gây cản, xung đột mạnh diễn ra liên tục và cuốn hút để thu hút giữ chân người đọc. Triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene. Tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Kết thúc phần này bằng một nút T ạt kịch tính, the point of no return, khiến nhân vật không còn đường lui. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết từng hành động nhỏ. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi trước khi đủ dung lượng, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp. Chỉ đang bắt buộc, đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó, hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Bắt buộc phải viết đủ số từ yêu cầu.
Show more. I notice you're requesting part 2, but the response I already provided above is part 2. It begins directly from the end of part 1, Elena cleaning the bathroom floor, and ends with the point of no return. He's already on the road. It runs approximately 4,000 plus words and covers all the escalating conflict structure you specified. Would you like me to write part 3 now, which per the treatment covers Lucian's confrontation with Garrett, Elena coming to the estate, and the deeper betrayal reveal? Just say the word, and I'll go straight into it. Lucian moved first. He turned to the young man in the corridor. His name was Dario, Elena would learn later, 23 years old and 3 years into whatever this life was, and said, with a quietness that was more alarming than shouting would have been, "How far out?" 40 minutes, maybe less. He's not alone. Volkov gave him 4 men and a vehicle. Which route? North Shore Expressway. They'll come off at, I know which exit. Lucian was already walking. Not running, walking, with the particular compressed velocity of someone whose default crisis setting was forward motion rather than reaction. He spoke without turning around. Elena, stay with Mara. Mara's the woman from the laundromat, Elena said. Yes. I'm not staying with anyone. She fell into step beside him, which required a longer stride than was comfortable. If Garrett is coming here, I need to know what the plan is. The plan is that you're not in the room where Garrett arrives. That's not a plan, that's a preference. He stopped, turned to look at her with an expression that contained several things at once. Impatience, something that might have been reluctant respect, and underneath both of those, a concern he clearly had no interest in naming directly.
Elena. Tell me what you're doing, she said. All of it, right now. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Dario. Give us the room. Dario disappeared around the corner with the practiced speed of someone who'd learned that certain conversations required witnesses to absent themselves immediately. Lucian moved to the window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the lake had gone from gray to the particular dark pewter that preceded a real storm, the surface choppy and disorganized, the horizon line erased by cloud. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his back mostly to her for a moment, and she understood that she was watching a man decide how much to say and in what order. Volkov has been positioning for 18 months, he said. This is not about you. You need to understand that first. You were not the inciting factor. You became available as leverage. He turned. Hale brought him intelligence about our operations, shipment schedules, contact names, the location of 2 of our distribution facilities. In exchange, Volkov provided resources to help Hale find you. The arrangement worked for both of them. Until you found out. Found out 6 weeks ago, when I was in a position to look, as I told you. He paused.
What I didn't tell you at the hospital is that I found out because someone inside my organization told Volkov I was looking, which means someone inside my organization knew I was looking and knew why, and chose to pass that information to an enemy. Elena felt the shape of what he was saying before he finished saying it. You have a leak, she said. Had. The word was flat and final. Past tense as of 72 hours ago. Who? He looked at her steadily. A man named Caruso. He'd been with me for 9 years. He was 3 levels into the organization's inner structure. A pause. He had a daughter with a degenerative condition. The treatment was expensive. Volkov found that out and used it. Elena said nothing. She was thinking about a man she'd never met. A father, cornered by love and cost and the specific desperation that came from watching someone you'd do anything for get slowly destroyed by something you couldn't fight with your hands. And she felt the story's ugliness the way you felt cold water, all at once. He's alive, Lucian said, and from the way he said it, she understood that this had required a specific decision, and that the decision had been neither automatic nor without cost. He's gone, completely. His family is relocated, and the daughter's treatment is being covered through a medical trust that has no visible connection to me. That's not generosity. It's the cleanest solution to a complicated problem. And Volkov still doesn't know you neutralized the leak. Volkov thinks Caruso is still in place and still feeding him. Something moved in Lucian's face, which is why Volkov moved the timeline. He got bad information. He thinks we're more exposed than we are. Elena absorbed this. You fed him false intelligence through your own compromised source. Yes. And Garrett is driving toward this estate right now based on information that you planted. Essentially. She looked at him. You were going to tell me this eventually. I was going to tell you when there was time to tell you properly. There's not time now. No, he agreed. There isn't. Somewhere in the east wing of the house, a door opened and voices moved through the building, low, rapid, the sounds of preparation. Elena could hear it through the walls, the specific texture of a household shifting from operational readiness into something more active. What happens when he gets here? She said. He won't get here. My people will intercept the vehicle before it reaches the gate. He watched her face. This is a controlled situation, Elena. I've been building toward it for weeks. Garrett arriving here tonight, led here by false information, with an unregistered weapon and 4 of Volkov's men in a vehicle, that is a gift. That is every piece of evidence I need to remove him from his position, his freedom, and Volkov's orbit simultaneously. Or it goes wrong, she said. Things go wrong. And then what? He held her gaze. Then we deal with what goes wrong. It was the most honest thing she could imagine anyone saying in that position, and somehow it was more steadying than any amount of reassurance would have been. She nodded once. He turned and they walked together toward the east wing. The intercept happened at 11:47 at night, 1,200 meters from the estate's northern gate, on a stretch of road that ran through the tree line between the property and the nearest public road. Elena didn't see it. Lucien had been very clear about that, and for once she hadn't argued, partly because she recognized the tactical logic, and partly because Mara had placed herself in the doorway of the study with the polite immovability of a boulder, and Elena had decided that some battles were not worth the expenditure. She heard it. Muffled, distant, tires, then voices, then a silence that had a different quality than the silence that preceded it. The kind of silence that meant something had been resolved. 22 minutes later, Lucien came back. He came in through the side entrance, and Elena, who had been sitting in the study pretending to read something on her phone, looked up and read his face the way she'd learned to read faces in triage, fast, looking for what was controlled versus what was leaking through. What she saw was controlled. Barely. He's in custody, Lucien said. Garrett and all 4 of Volkov's men. The vehicle has been secured. The weapon has been photographed and documented. He stopped in the doorway. His shirt was wrong. Not damaged, just displaced, like he'd moved fast enough that the careful presentation had slipped. There was a complication. Elena set the phone down. What kind? One of Volkov's men, before we contained the vehicle. He made a call. Lucien crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, heavily, with the particular weight of a man whose adrenaline had run its full course and left the bill behind. 20 seconds. maybe less. We don't know who he reached. Volkov. Possibly. Probably. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor between them for a moment. This changes the next 48 hours. You wanted to handle this quietly, she said. Yes. And now Volkov knows his men have been taken. Yes. Which means he knows the intelligence was false. Lucian looked up at her. In the lamplit room, with the lake invisible behind the dark windows, he looked older than he had in the corridor. Not defeated. She didn't think his face did defeated, but marked in a way that had to do with the specific fatigue of a plan that had been executed well and still produced damage. Which means he knows Caruso was turned, he said. Yes. Is Caruso's family already moved? They were moved 2 days ago. He said it quickly, like he'd anticipated the question and wanted to clear it out of the way. They're safe. But Caruso... A pause. Caruso had instructions. If Volkov moved against him, he had a place to go. His jaw shifted slightly. Whether he followed those instructions is not something I can currently confirm. Elena heard what lived in that sentence. She didn't push on it. What do we do with Garrett? She said. That depends on what you want. He said it the same way he had before, in the study earlier. The question handed back, clean, without manipulation, like he genuinely intended to let her drive that particular piece. I told you what I want. Yes. Destruction without death, institutional collapse. He nodded slowly. That's achievable. The documentation we have, the unregistered weapon, the association with Volkov's men, the financial records linking him to the intelligence payments, that's enough to end his career and his freedom simultaneously. My lawyer has been preparing the package for 2 weeks. A call to the right federal contact tomorrow morning, and Garrett Hale's entire constructed reality begins to dismantle. Tomorrow morning, she said. Yes. So tonight he's here, in this building. In the East Wing, contained. Elena stood up. She wasn't sure she'd decided to stand up. Her body just did it, the way it sometimes made decisions that her conscious mind hadn't signed off on. I want to see him, she said. Elena, I'm not going to touch him. I'm not going to do anything that complicates your legal package. She looked at Lucian. I just want him to see me, standing up, in a room he can't leave. I want him to understand that it's over before it's actually over. She paused. I've earned that much. Lucian looked at her for a long time. She could see him running it against whatever calculus he used for decisions like this. Risk, exposure, the psychological variables she suspected he was better at modeling than he let on. 5 minutes, he said. I'm in the room. Fine. Garrett Hale looked smaller. That was the first thing. She'd spent 14 months carrying him at full scale in the architecture of her fear. Large, credentialed, backed by institutional weight. A man with resources and a smile that could make a room believe whatever he needed it to believe. The man zip-tied to the chair in Lucian's East Wing utility room was all of those things still, technically. The credentials existed. The smile was still structurally present, turned on now, and aimed at her as she came through the door, reflexive and automatic. The expression so deeply habitual that he probably didn't know he was doing it. But the room changed him. Or maybe she did. Maybe the thing that changed was her. Elena. His voice was the same, warm, practiced, with the particular timbre that had once made her feel chosen. You look good. She didn't say anything. She stood 6 feet from him and looked at him the way she'd looked at Lucian's wounds on her bathroom floor. Assessingly, without flinching, cataloging. His jaw was cut. From the intercept, she assumed. His left eye was beginning to swell. He was dressed in civilian clothes, which looked wrong on him in the way that plain clothes always looked wrong on men whose identity was constructed around uniform and authority. Without the badge, without the stance it produced, he was just a man in a flannel shirt with a cut on his jaw and eyes that were working very hard at something. You should have stayed disappeared, he said, still pleasant, still operating the smile. That's not a threat. I'm just saying. You were good at it. Better than I expected. A brief pause. I would have found you eventually. I always do. You found a building, she said. You found an empty apartment. I found you. His eyes moved to Lucian standing at the door, and something in them shifted. A flicker of genuine hatred, unperformed, that was almost more human than anything else she'd seen from him so far.
Your new friend did impressive work. I'll give him that. He's going to take your badge, Elena said. Your pension, your freedom, everything you built the last 14 years, all of it. She kept her voice level. The federal complaint gets filed in the morning. Garrett looked back at her. The smile didn't disappear. It modified, became something sharper and less comfortable to be in the same room as. You think this is over, he said. I know it is. Elena. He leaned forward against the zip ties with a slow, deliberate movement, like a man making a point by existing in a particular direction. You know what I've learned in 14 years of detective work? It's never over until it's actually over. And the people who think it's over before that point are always the ones who get surprised. He held her gaze. Arkady Volkov is not a man whose assets you contain in an East Wing utility room and file a complaint about in the morning. He's a man who receives a phone call and responds accordingly. His man made a call, Elena said. We know. Then you know you have about 4 hours. The room was very quiet. 4 hours until what? Lucian said from the door. Garrett looked at him with the full flat weight of his genuine expression, the one behind all the performance. Until he decides that cleaning this up is worth more than whatever you think you have on him. He sat back. He'll burn the whole game board, every piece. Your estate, your people, your documentation. His eyes moved back to Elena. You. He's bluffing, Lucian said. Maybe, Garrett said, still looking at Elena. Ask yourself how confident you are in that, Seb. Elena came out of the utility room and walked directly to the end of the corridor and put both hands flat on the wall and breathed. Just breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The method her therapist, the one she'd had to abandon along with everything else, had given her for moments of acute overwhelm. Lucien came out 30 seconds behind her. He's trying to rattle you, he said. I know what he's doing. She pushed off the wall and turned around. Is he right about the 4 hours? A beat. Just long enough to be an answer in itself. Volkov is unpredictable when he feels cornered, Lucian said. He's a man who operates on the principle that overwhelming force applied before the opponent can regroup is more efficient than careful strategy. If his man reached him tonight, is he right about 4 hours? Possibly. She exhaled. Okay. She crossed her arms, holding herself together with the physical gesture because the internal architecture needed the help right now. Then we don't wait until morning. We file tonight, right now. Whatever federal contact you have, it's after midnight. I don't care what time it is. Lucian pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at her. She could see him deciding again, the same rapid interior calculation he ran when the variables shifted. Then he dialed. She turned away to give him the illusion of privacy and stood looking out the corridor window at the dark lake. The storm that had been building all evening had finally arrived. Rain against the glass, wind in the tree line. The kind of Midwestern November weather that felt like the sky making a statement. She heard him speaking behind her. Low, clipped, the voice he used when he needed someone to understand that the situation was past the point of scheduling. Then she heard him stop. Then silence of a different quality. She turned. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. Not in her bathroom, not in the hospital corridor, not in the utility room with Garrett 3 feet away. It had gone absolutely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his responses, but the stillness of a man who just received information that required him to recalculate everything from the foundation. What? She said. He lowered the phone. The federal contact, he said. The man I've been building the complaint package with for 3 weeks. He stopped, looked at her. He's Volkov's. The words landed and just sat there. Your federal contact has been Volkov's asset for at least 18 months. The call my contact just received from me is the second call he's made in the last 20 minutes. Lucian's voice was the same temperature as the glass she could feel through the window behind her. The first was to Volkov. Elena felt the entire architecture of the last 6 weeks restructure itself in approximately 4 seconds. Every conversation, every staged piece of intelligence, every carefully managed step toward dismantling Garrett Hale through proper channels, all of it fed directly into the hands of the man they were dismantling it against. He knows everything, she said. Everything we gave the federal contact, yes. Which is the documentation, the financial records, the timeline. A pause.
The location of this estate confirmed through official channels rather than inference. Outside, the rain came harder. She could hear it against the stone of the building. Not just the windows now, but the walls, like the weather had decided to make its presence unambiguous. "How long?" she said. "If he mobilizes immediately." Lucian looked at his watch. He looked at it the way a surgeon looks at the clock above the operating table, not with panic, with the specific focus of someone who has just been handed a completely new problem and is already solving it. "Less than 4 hours, maybe 2. Can we move?" "We can move. Moving creates exposure. Volkov will have eyes on the roads. Can we move or not?" "Yes." "Then we move." She walked past him toward the study. "And you tell me everything, not the managed version, not the version where you decide what I need to know and in what order. Everything, because whoever is making decisions tonight, it's both of us." He was quiet for 2 steps. Then, "Yes." "And Garrett?" "He comes with us. We can't leave him here and we can't release him." She stopped in the doorway of the study and looked back at Lucian. He was standing in the corridor with the rain against the windows and the lamplight behind him, and he looked like the exact thing she'd been afraid of for 6 weeks. Not an enemy, which she could have managed, but something more complicated and more permanent than that. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "Caruso," he said. "My man. The one I told you was given instructions and a place to go if Volkov moved against him." He looked at her with the eyes of a man reading out a sentence he'd rather not be reading. "He didn't go to the safe location." A pause. "He went to Volkov." The silence between them was absolute. "He went voluntarily," Elena said. "Yes. After you relocated his family, after you covered his daughter's treatment." "Yes." "Why?" Lucien's jaw set in a way that she recognized as the physical expression of something he was refusing to let into his voice. "Because Volkov offered him something I couldn't." He paused. "His daughter's complete recovery. A treatment that doesn't exist through any legitimate medical channel. Volkov has the resources and the connections to access it." His eyes held hers. "I had him for 9 years. I gave him everything I could, and Volkov offered him his child's life." Elena stood in the doorway and felt, for the first time since all of this had started, that she was looking at the absolute bottom of it, the place where every good intention and every careful plan ran out of floor. She thought about a father watching his daughter deteriorate, about the specific quality of desperation that didn't care about loyalty or morality or anything else, just the next treatment, the next possibility, the next door that might open onto something different. She thought about her own 3 police reports. She thought about the rubber band and $300 under the baseboard. "We need to go," she said. "Yes," said Lucien. Down the corridor, Mara appeared with 2 go bags and the expression of a woman who had been packed and ready since the moment the first phone call had ended, because she'd understood the shape of the situation before anyone said a word. And from the east wing, from behind a locked door, Garrett Hale's voice came through the walls. Not shouting, not panicking, just talking in the steady conversational tone of a man who knew he'd already detonated the thing he'd come to detonate and was content to sit inside the wreckage and wait. 4 hours, he called. "Give or take." Lucien looked at Elena. Elena looked at Lucien. She picked up one of the go bags. They moved at 12:23 in the morning. Lucien had 3 vehicles ready inside the estate's underground garage. Not the ostentatious kind of vehicle that announced money, but the kind that disappeared into traffic, mid-range, dark-colored, with plates that were clean and reinforced frames that weren't. Garrett was moved first, wrists still secured, transferred with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before, and understood that speed mattered more than comfort. He didn't resist. He walked with the loose, unhurried gait of a man who had already decided that whatever happened next was going to happen, regardless of how he held his shoulders, and that he might as well conserve energy. Elena watched him get put in the second vehicle and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not pity, not satisfaction, something in between, the complicated residue of looking at a person who had structured years of your life around fear and finding that up close, zip-tied and cut-jawed in a parking garage, he was just a man who'd made a particular set of choices. She got in the first vehicle. Lucien got in beside her. Mara drove. "Where are we going?" Elena said. A facility on the south side, industrial district. We've used it before. Lucien was on his phone, texting with the focused, rapid attention of someone conducting 3 conversations simultaneously. It's not connected to the estate, not connected to any of our primary locations. Does Volkov know about it? No. Are you certain? He looked up from the phone. In the moving darkness of the car, with the rain still coming down and the city's ambient light sliding across the windows in irregular pulses, his face was stripped of everything extraneous. I'm certain of less than I was 3 hours ago, he said. I'm telling you my best assessment. She nodded. That was the right answer. She was learning to distinguish between his honest answers and his managed ones, and the honest ones had a specific texture, shorter, blunter, without the careful structural scaffolding he built around things he was uncertain about. Dario was in the back seat. He'd been quiet since the garage. He was quiet now, looking out the window with the expression of someone who was processing something internally and hadn't finished. Dario, Lucien said without looking up from his phone. Yeah. Tell me what you haven't told me. A pause that lasted 4 seconds and said everything. Caruso reached out to me, Dario said. Before tonight, 2 days ago. The car didn't change speed. Mara's hands didn't move on the wheel. Lucien's thumbs stopped moving on the phone. Go on, he said. He said he wanted to come back, that he'd made a mistake going to Volkov, that the deal for his daughter was, he said the deal wasn't what they told him it was. The treatment they promised, it's not. Dario stopped, started again. It doesn't exist. Volkov told him it existed to get him. There's no experimental treatment. His daughter isn't going to get anything. The silence in the car was absolute except for the rain and the tires. And you didn't tell me, Lucien said. He asked me not to. He said he needed time to... Dario. I know. The young man's voice had gone raw. I know. I should have told you the moment he called. I know that. Lucien was quiet for a long time, long enough that the city's southern edge began to replace the northern residential streets outside the windows. Buildings getting lower, spaces getting wider, the specific geometry of industrial Chicago replacing the lakeshore architecture they'd left behind. Where's Caruso now? He said. He said he'd be at the drop point on Racine, the one we used in... I know the one. He said he'd be there at 1 in the morning, with documentation. Dario's voice dropped. He said Volkov's full operational plan, tonight's action, routes, numbers, objectives, all of it. Another pause. He said it's his way back. Lucien looked at his watch. It was 12:41. Mara, he said. Already calculating, she said. We can make it. If the construction on Halstead is cleared, yes. Elena looked at Lucien. It could be a trap. Yes. Caruso went to Volkov, voluntarily. Volkov found out the intelligence was false. He's had 2 days with Caruso since then. She kept her voice level. If Volkov told Caruso what to say to Dario, then the drop point on Racine is where Volkov wants us, Lucien finished. Yes, I've run that. And I've also run the alternative, which is that a man was lied to about his daughter's life and has decided to burn down everything he built with Volkov to pay for it. He looked at her. I've known Caruso for 9 years. I know what he sounds like when he's been turned against me. I also know what he sounds like when he's backed into a corner with nothing left to protect. He paused. The version Dario described sounds like the second one. You could be wrong. I could be wrong, he agreed. What do we do if you're wrong? We deal with what goes wrong, he said, and it was the same thing he'd said in the corridor of the estate, the same honest, terrible answer, and she realized that this was what it actually looked like to operate inside a life like his. Not confidence, not invulnerability, but the specific commitment to keep moving through uncertainty because stopping was worse. Racine, she said. Mara was already turning. Oh. The drop point was a parking structure 3 levels deep, accessed through a service entrance off Racine Avenue that had a broken gate latch and a camera that had been non-operational for 2 years. Lucien's people had used it for exchanges before, the kind of parking structure that the city had half forgotten, serving a warehouse complex that had been rezoned and abandoned and rezoned again and was currently in the legal ambiguity between one use and the next. They took the ramp down to level 2. Caruso was there. Elena hadn't known what she expected. The version Lucien had described, 9 years, inner structure, a father, had assembled itself into a particular kind of image. The man leaning against the concrete pillar on level 2 was smaller than that image. Compact, 50s, with the weathered quality of someone who'd spent a long time in difficult conditions and had the physical vocabulary to show for it. He was holding an envelope against his chest with both hands, the way a person holds something they're afraid of losing. When the headlights hit him, he didn't flinch. He just looked at the car with an expression of exhausted resolution, like a man who had made his last decision and was waiting to see what it cost. Lucian got out first. Elena stayed in the car. She watched through the windshield as Lucian crossed the concrete toward Caruso. Unhurried, hands visible. The particular body language of a man who had the upper hand and was choosing not to perform it. She couldn't hear the conversation from inside the car. She could read the shape of it. Caruso spoke first, at length, his hands remaining still except for the one holding the envelope. Lucian listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was unusual for him and meant he was taking in something he considered significant. Then Lucian said something short. Caruso responded. Lucian held out his hand. Caruso gave him the envelope. Something in the exchange relaxed then. Not comfortable, not forgiven, but whatever tightest thread had been running through Caruso's posture released slightly, and he put both hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground. Lucian turned and walked back to the vehicle. He got in, closed the door, and opened the envelope. Photographs. Printed pages. A hand-drawn diagram that covered a folded sheet of paper in dense notation. Volkov's moving a convoy, Lucian said. He was reading quickly, eyes tracking across the pages with the focused speed of someone who knew the geography being referenced. Not toward the estate. He's smarter than that. He assumed we'd run. He turned a page. He's targeting the Underground Expressway interchange at Canal and Harrison. He knows we use it as a transit route when we move significant personnel or materials through the south side. He stopped, looked up. He's not coming for the estate. He's setting up an ambush on the route we'd logically take to move Garrett to any secure location we control. Which is what we're doing, Elena said. Which is exactly what we're doing. He predicted our move. He predicted the logical move. What we'd have to do if we left the estate quickly with a prisoner and needed to reach a controlled facility on the south side. Lucien looked at the diagram. He has armored vehicles, 6 of them, positioned at 3 points on the expressway interchange. Automatic weapons. A team of at least 18 men. Dario from the back seat. That's not an ambush, that's a demolition. Yes, Lucien said. He looked at Mara. Get me Reyes. Mara made a call, handed the phone back. Lucien spoke for 90 seconds in a voice that Elena could only describe as operational, stripped of everything personal, reduced to information and instruction. The voice of a man who managed crisis the way a surgeon managed an open chest cavity. Fast, precise, without the luxury of feeling it while the work was happening. He ended the call. We have 40 minutes before the convoy is in position, he said. We can reroute and avoid the interchange entirely. Or, Elena said. He looked at her. Or we know exactly where they are, she said. And they don't know we know. The car was quiet. Caruso's intelligence has a cost, Lucien said carefully. I understand that. If we use it, if we move against Volkov's position tonight, using information from a man who came to us 40 minutes ago through a channel that could theoretically have been staged, you said you believed him. I do. Then we use it, she said. You have people, Lucien. You have resources and vehicles and men who know how to do this. And Volkov is sitting at a fixed position waiting for you to drive into him. She held his gaze. That's not a threat. That's a target. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. He was past surprise at what came out of her mouth. Something more like recognition, like a man watching a person become, in real time, the version of themselves that circumstances had been building toward. He picked up the phone again. They hit the interchange at 1:58 in the morning. Lucien's convoy went in from the north end. 3 vehicles, moving fast, with the specific aggressive velocity that communicated intent rather than haste. Volkov's men were positioned at the south blockade and hadn't yet registered the approach from the wrong direction when the east entry opened simultaneously and 2 more of Lucien's vehicles came through. Elena was in the second vehicle of the northern approach, between Mara and a man named Torres,
who had the compressed economical build of someone who'd spent a long time in places where excess movement got people killed. She had been told, clearly, and with the specific weight of someone who intended to be obeyed, to stay in the vehicle. She had the medical bag on her lap. The first exchange of gunfire lasted 11 seconds. She counted. It was something she did in trauma situations. Count, because counting gave the brain a structure to operate inside when the surrounding environment was doing everything in its power to dissolve that structure. 11 seconds of short, sharp percussion that the concrete walls of the expressway interchange turned into something overwhelming, the sound bouncing and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. Then a pause. Then voices, shouting, not panicked, operational, the specific call and response of people who'd trained for coordinated movement. Then more gunfire, further away, from the east entry. Torres was on a radio. Mara had her hands on the wheel and her eyes moving between the windshield and the mirrors with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who'd learned that the thing that killed you was usually the thing you weren't looking at. North blockade is down, Torres said into the radio. Then listening. East team has contact. They're pushing through. Volkov's men in the center, Mara said. Caught between. Yeah. Elena watched through the windshield. The interchange's overhead lighting was industrial and intermittent, some functioning, some dark, creating a landscape of sharp illumination and absolute shadow. She could see the shapes of vehicles across the interchange floor, some stationary, one at an angle that suggested it had been moved hastily and hadn't been moved far enough. She saw Lucian. He was on foot, which was not what he was supposed to be. She could see him through the windshield moving along the eastern wall of the interchange with two of his people flanking him, using the cover of a stopped armored vehicle, and the way he was moving told her two things simultaneously. First, that the situation was more controlled than the noise suggested, and second, that he was heading somewhere specific with a specific intention. She saw Garrett. He was out of the vehicle. She didn't know how. Later she'd learned that in the chaos of the northern approach, the door of his transport had been opened by one of Volkov's men who'd gotten close enough to the vehicle before being pushed back, and that Garrett, with his hands still secured in front of him rather than behind, had used the open door and the distraction to move. He was moving toward her vehicle, not toward the exit, toward her vehicle specifically, with the directional certainty of a man who'd tracked her position throughout the approach and had decided that the exchange of fire around him was a resource rather than a threat. His wrists were still secured, but he'd gotten his hands in front of him and he was moving with the low, rapid crouch of a man who'd trained for exactly this kind of environment. Mara, Elena said, I see him. I see him. But Volkov's remaining men were between Mara and the exit, and Torres was already out of the vehicle dealing with a situation at the eastern wall, and Garrett covered the last 30 meters in less time than Elena had to process it, and then his hands were on the door handle and he was pulling it open and looking at her with the expression of a man who had just found the only thing in the room that still mattered to him. Get out, he said. Elena looked at him. Her hands were on the medical bag. Her heart was doing the percussive thing again, the thing that was not panic, but lived in the same neighborhood. No, she said. He reached in and grabbed her arm. She swung the medical bag. It was not a graceful movement. It was not a trained movement. It was the movement of a person who had been grabbed by this particular set of hands before, and whose body remembered what that meant, and responded before the conscious mind had finished authorizing the response. The bag was heavy, packed with supplies, with the compression bandages and suture kits and irrigation syringes that were her professional reality, and it connected with Garrett's forearm with enough force to break his grip. He grabbed again. She pulled back against the far door. Mara was turning from the front seat with one hand coming up, and then Garrett was gone. Not gone. Removed. Lifted, essentially, from the doorway by a force that came from behind him and processed him backward 3 steps and into the concrete wall of the interchange with a sound that was not pleasant to hear. Lucian had him by the collar with one hand and the secured wrists with the other, and the expression on Lucian's face was not the controlled, compressed expression Elena had come to read as his default. It was something rawer than that, something that had shed the management layer and was operating directly on what was underneath. He drove Garrett into the wall a second time, not with the theatrical brutality of someone performing violence, with the specific, deliberate force of someone making a structural point. Garrett's head snapped back against the concrete. His knees buckled. "Don't," Lucian said. Just that. Garrett was breathing through his mouth, both eyes open, tracking, still thinking. She could see it, the machine behind his face running assessments even now. He looked at Lucian with the flat hatred she'd glimpsed in the utility room, unperformed and absolute. "This doesn't change anything," Garrett said. His voice was rough but controlled. "Volkov has 20 more men outside this interchange. You cleared the room, but you didn't clear the—" "I know what I cleared," Lucian said. "Then you know this is finished," Lucian said. "This is finished." He pulled Garrett off the wall and turned him and walked him back toward the center of the interchange with the purposeful authority of a man who had decided that the situation was over and was implementing that decision physically before anything else could argue with it. Elena got out of the vehicle. She didn't decide to. She got out the way she'd gotten up in the study, body moving ahead of authorization, and she was walking across the interchange floor with the medical bag still in her hand when she heard the sound. Not gunfire, something different. A sharp, wet, bitten-off sound from her left. She turned. One of Lucian's men, she'd seen him at the estate, young, dark-haired, she didn't know his name, was down on one knee beside a stopped vehicle with both hands pressed to his throat. Not his throat. His neck, below the collarbone, the right lateral side. Arterial. She knew from 20 feet away, from the color and the rate, and the way his hands weren't doing anything meaningful against it. She moved. She didn't think about the gunfire that had been happening 30 seconds ago, or about whether it was still happening, or about the Volkov men that Garrett had just mentioned with the specific confidence of someone stating a fact. She moved the way she moved in the trauma bay when the clock was visible and running, fast, low, direct, with the medical bag already unzipped before she reached him. "Look at me," she said, landing on her knees beside him. The concrete was wet. She registered this distantly. His name, she still didn't know it. "Look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were present, scared but present, which was what mattered. "I've got you," she said. "Hands down. Let me see it." He moved his hands. She assessed in 2 seconds and reached into the bag. The gunfire was still happening somewhere in the interchange. She could hear it, further east, the echo of it distorted by the concrete cavern. She could hear voices, running footsteps, the specific sounds of a situation working toward resolution through force. She processed all of this in the background, filed it, and focused on the neck of the man in front of her, on the compression pack she was applying and the angle of her hands and the count that she was running internally, because counting kept the brain on the work. "What's your name?" she said. "Marco." His voice was thin, losing air pressure. "Marco, stay with me. This is manageable. I need you to stay still. There's a—" He tried to move. "Move. Still." She applied pressure and felt the bleeding slow. Not stop, slow, which was what she had to work with. "Who gave you orders tonight, Marco?" "Lucienne." The name came out on a shallow breath. "Then do what I'm telling you, because I'm the reason Lucian is alive, and you can tell him I said that later." She shifted her grip. "Still." He went still. She worked. Around her, the interchange continued its resolution. Less noise now, the specific quality of diminishing conflict rather than escalating. The difference between a fire burning through available fuel and a fire going out. She tracked it peripherally. She kept her hands where they were. She didn't see Lucian come back. She felt him. The change in the air, the specific presence of someone standing directly behind her, close, watching her work with a quality of attention that was different from the operational focus of the last 20 minutes. She didn't turn around. She finished the secondary compression, checked Marco's pulse, present, weaker than she'd like, but present, and looked up. Torres was crouching on Marco's other side. Mara stood 6 feet back. Dario was behind her. The interchange was quiet. She became aware that her hands were shaking. Not during, they never shook during, after. Always after, when the task was finished and the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, they shook with the honest physical record of what the last several minutes had required. She pressed them flat against her thighs and turned around. Lucian was looking at her with an expression she didn't have prior experience reading. Not the measuring look, not the managed, compressed professional face, something that had no management layer on it at all, that was simply what it was without scaffolding. Garrett was secured again, against the eastern wall.
this time with Torres's undivided attention and no available doors. "Volkov?" Elena said. "His convoy turned before reaching the interchange," Lucian said. "When his men inside didn't make radio contact on schedule, he pulled back." He paused. "He'll regroup." "How long?" "Hours, maybe less." He looked at her hands, pressed flat against her thighs, then at her face. "You shouldn't have gotten out of the vehicle." "Marco is alive," she said. "You could have been—" "Marco is alive," she said again, evenly. Not combative, just stating the fact that she was going to keep stating until it occupied the correct amount of space in the conversation. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. In the damaged, intermittent light of the interchange, with gunfire residue still in the air and Marco's blood on her hands, and Garrett Hale against the far wall watching them both with his calculating, undefeated eyes, something settled between them. Not romantic, not yet, but foundational in a way that was its own kind of permanence. "We need to move Marco," she said. "He needs a proper surgical environment in the next 20 minutes, or the compression won't be enough." "I know a place." "How many people will be there?" "Enough." "Lucien," she held his gaze, "Volkov is regrouping. Garrett is still walking around with everything in his head. And the one federal contact you trusted for 3 weeks was working against you the whole time." She paused. "Who else are we walking into?" He looked at her with the honest, unscaffolded expression. "I don't know," he said. From the eastern wall, Garrett made a sound. Not a laugh, a breath, through the nose, that carried the precise weight of a laugh without the effort of producing one. He was looking at the ceiling of the interchange, at the broken lights above. "He doesn't know," Garrett said, to no one in particular. "After all this, he still doesn't know." He brought his eyes down and found Elena across the distance. "But I do," he said. Elena looked at him. He looked back. And the thing in his expression, not the performed smile, not the flat hatred, but something underneath both of those, something older and more certain, told her that whatever he knew, it was not finished yet, and he had been waiting for exactly this moment to make her understand that. "Show more." "What do you know?" Elena said. Not loud, not heated. The kind of quiet that came from a person who had learned, through prolonged and specific experience, that raising her voice at Garrett Hale produced nothing useful. She crossed the interchange floor toward him with the medical bag still in her hand, and the blood still on her fingers, and she stopped 4 feet away, and looked at him with the expression she'd used on her bathroom floor the night Lucien had come through her window. A problem with a solution, somewhere in there, if she could find the right angle. Garrett looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for this particular audience for a long time. "There's a second federal contact," he said. "Not the one Volkov owns, a real one. A woman named Solis. Claire Solis, DOJ, Organized Crime Division. She's been building a case against Volkov for 11 months. He paused, letting it settle. "She's also been building one against Lucian." Elena didn't move. "Both of them," Garrett said. "Same investigation, same file. The plan was always to take them down together, use the conflict between them to generate evidence on both sides, then close the door simultaneously." He watched her face. "Everything Lucian has been doing to set me up, the documentation package, the financial records, the evidence linking me to Volkov, all of it is sitting inside an active federal investigation that does not belong to him. The moment he files, he doesn't dismantle me. He walks into a room that was already built with his name on the wall." Elena turned. Lucien was 5 feet behind her. He had heard every word. She could tell by the particular stillness he'd gone into. Not shock. Lucien didn't do shock. But the specific quality of a man running a very fast internal calculation against a variable he had not previously included in the model. "Solis," he said. "You know the name," Garrett said. "I know the name." "Then you know I'm not making it up." Lucian's jaw shifted. Something moved through his face that was not quite anger and not quite the cold operational focus she'd seen in the interchange. Something between them, the specific expression of a man who had been playing chess for 6 weeks against an opponent he thought he understood and had just discovered there was a third player at the table who'd been there the whole time. "How long have you known about Solis?" Lucien said. "Since month 4 of her investigation. I have a contact inside the DOJ field office." Garrett said it without apology. She reached out to me informally in month 6. She thought I might have material useful to her case against Volkov. He paused. I told her I might. I didn't tell her I was already on Volkov's payroll, which she knew anyway, which was why she approached me instead of going through official channels. She was going to use you, Elena said. Everybody was going to use everybody. Garrett looked at her. That's the ecosystem. That's what it actually looks like in there. A beat. Solis is real, and her case is real, and if Lucian files his package tomorrow morning, it lands in the middle of her operation, and one of two things happens. Either she folds him into the case, and he spends the next 3 years in a federal holding pattern while she builds toward a trial that may or may not go the way she intends. Or she shuts the package down, classifies the evidence, and Lucien's entire 6 weeks of work disappears into a file that doesn't officially exist. The interchange was very quiet. Marco's breathing, shallow but steady, from where Torres was maintaining pressure on his wound 20 feet away. The distant sound of the city, muffled by concrete and depth. The rain, which Elena realized she could no longer hear. It had stopped at some point during the last 40 minutes without her registering it. "Why are you telling us this?" she said. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. In the damaged light of the interchange, with the cut on his jaw dried to a dark line, and his flannel shirt wrong in all the ways it had been wrong since she'd first seen him in the utility room, he looked tired in a way that was different from his usual performance of effort. Genuinely tired. The kind of tired that came from a long time spent maintaining a version of yourself that required constant structural support. "Because I want a deal," he said. Elena stared at him. "Not from you," he said quickly. Not defensively, just accurately. "From him." His eyes moved to Lucian. "I have 4 years of operational intelligence on Volkov. Names, routes, accounts, the location of assets that Solis doesn't have and can't get without a source inside his organization. Material that would let Lucien remove Volkov permanently, not through federal channels, not through a trial that takes 3 years and might not stick. Permanently." He let that word occupy its full space. "In exchange, I walk. Not free. I understand that's not available. I lose the badge, I lose the pension, I leave Chicago, and I don't come back." He paused. "And I never come near Elena again, legally enforceable, whatever architecture makes that work." Lucian said nothing. "I know what you think of me," Garrett said. "I'm not asking you to think differently. I'm telling you the transaction. You can evaluate it on its merits." Lucian turned and walked away from Garrett to the far end of the interchange. Elena followed him. Behind them, Torres's voice, low and steady, continued talking Marco through the wait. At the far wall, Lucien stopped. He put one hand flat against the concrete and looked at it for a moment, and she understood that the gesture was the physical equivalent of what she did when she pressed her hands to her thighs, somewhere to put the internal pressure while the thinking happened. "He's not wrong about Solis," he said. "I know her reputation. She's thorough and she's patient, and she has the institutional backing to wait a long time for the shape she wants." He didn't look up from the wall. "If I file the package and she folds it into her operation, I lose control of the outcome. Everything I've built toward Elena's protection becomes a variable inside someone else's case." "So the deal makes tactical sense," Elena said. "Yes." "That doesn't mean we take it." He looked up at her. "No, it doesn't." He searched her face. "What do you want to do?" She crossed her arms. The medical bag hung from her right hand, the strap looped around her wrist. She thought about the 3 police reports, about the officer who'd looked past her shoulder, about the formal review that had ended with a commendation, about every institutional channel she had trusted and everyone that had failed her, not through incompetence, but through the specific structural failure of systems that protected their own. "Contact Solis," she said, "tonight, not to file the package. To talk." She held Lucien's gaze. "She wants Volkov. We have Garrett, who has 4 years of operational intelligence on Volkov and is currently motivated to share it. We have documentation on Garrett that gives us leverage. And you have whatever you've built over 6 weeks." She paused. "Give her Volkov. All of it. On our terms, not hers. Garrett cooperates fully in exchange for the deal he outlined, but Solis is the one who enforces the legal architecture. Not you, not me. A federal officer whose name is on the record." "You trust a federal officer," he said. I trust the arrangement more than I trust Garrett walking away on a handshake with a man he has no reason to fear. She looked at him. He's afraid of Solace. That's why he brought her up. He knows she has enough to take him down even without Volkov. He's in her file already. This is him trying to get ahead of it. She paused. Let's let him think he did. Lucian looked at her with the unscaffolded expression, the one without management. It had been happening more often over the last hour, she'd noticed. Each time the situation stripped another layer off the controlled professional face, what appeared underneath was not what she'd expected from a man with his history. Not calculation, not coldness. Something that looked, in the damaged light of a concrete interchange at 2 in the morning, very much like a person who had spent a long time alone inside the structure he'd built and was only now registering what he'd been missing. He pulled out his phone. He had Solis's number. Of course he did. She didn't ask how. Claire Solis arrived at the interchange at 4:17 in the morning. She came with 2 agents and no performance. Mid-50s, short, with the compact, efficient bearing of a woman who had long since stopped spending energy on anything that didn't move her objectives forward. She looked at the interchange, the stopped vehicles, the secured men from Volkov's team, Garrett against the eastern wall, Marco on the ground with Torres, Elena with dried blood on her hands. And she took it in the way a person reads a room they've been trying to understand from the outside for a long time. She looked at Lucian first, then at Elena. "You're the nurse," she said. "Yes." "You've been living under an assumed identity for 14 months. 18, Elena said. "The first 4 were before I changed my name." Solis looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face that was not quite sympathy and not quite professional assessment. Something more honest than either. "The reports you filed," she said. "I have them. All 3. A pause. "I want you to know I read them." Elena looked back at her. "They didn't go anywhere." "No." Solis held her gaze. "That ends tonight." The negotiation took 3 hours. Elena sat through most of it in a folding chair that someone produced from one of the vehicles, with a cup of coffee that Dario had sourced from somewhere and pressed into her hands without comment, and she listened to Garrett dismantle himself with the specific thoroughness of a man who had made his calculation and committed to it completely. He gave Solis 4 years of Volkov's operational infrastructure, routes, names, account structures, the location of a storage facility in Gary, Indiana, that Solis's team had been searching for since the previous March. He gave it systematically, in the order she requested, without visible reluctance. The performance of cooperation from a man who'd understood the terms. He did not look at Elena during any of it. She watched him and tried to locate what she felt. What she found was not what she'd expected to find. Not satisfaction, not the clean vindication she'd spent 14 months building toward in the abstract. What she found was more like the aftermath of a long physical effort, a bone-deep fatigue, the specific emotional texture of a body that had been running on crisis chemistry for so long that the removal of the crisis left a gap that hadn't yet been filled by anything else. At 6:41 in the morning, Solis stood up from the temporary table her agents had assembled from equipment cases and looked at Garrett with the expression of a woman closing a file she'd been holding open for a long time. "You understand the terms," she said. "Yes." Badge surrendered as of this morning. Pension forfeited. Permanent relocation outside the state of Illinois. No contact, direct or indirect, with Elena Marsh Voss, her colleagues, her associates, or her family members. Violation of any term reopens the full federal case. She paused. "And you cooperate fully with our operation against Volkov through its conclusion. Whatever we need, whenever we need it. Understood." "Then we're done here." She gestured to one of her agents. "Take him." Garrett stood up. He was walked toward the ramp by Solis's agent, and Elena watched him go with her hands around the coffee cup and her back straight. He didn't look at her at the ramp either. She thought he was going to make it out of the interchange without it. At the bottom of the ramp, he stopped. He turned. He looked at her across the full length of the interchange floor with the flat, unperformed face. Not the smile, not the hatred, not the calculation. Something underneath all of those. Something she thought might be the actual Garrett Hale before 14 years of institutional power had finished constructing the version the world knew. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the floor for a moment. Then he went up the ramp, and was gone. Elena sat with whatever that was for a long moment. Then she set the coffee cup down. Oh, Marco came out of surgery at noon. The facility was a private clinic on the near west side, not a hospital, not a licensed surgical center in any official sense, but staffed by two physicians whose credentials were real, even if their current employment arrangement was not, and equipped with more than Elena would have expected. She'd scrubbed in as a second pair of hands, not because they needed her, but because she needed to be useful, because standing in a waiting room was its own kind of unbearable, and her hands remembered how to be steady in there even when the rest of her didn't. He came through clean. The arterial injury had been less catastrophic than the initial presentation suggested, deep, serious, correctly managed in the field. And the surgeon's assessment afterward was the specific guarded optimism that Elena recognized as the honest version of good news in their profession. She sat outside the recovery room on the bench in the corridor and finally, for the first time since the previous morning, did not move for a while. Lucien found her there 20 minutes later. He sat down beside her, not close, with the particular awareness of a man who understood that proximity required permission. He had changed his shirt somewhere in the last several hours. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he offered her one, and she took it, and they sat in the corridor with the coffee and said nothing for almost a full minute. Solis moved on Volkov's facility in Gary at 8 this morning, he said. I know. Dario told me. They found what Garrett said they'd find, more actually. He paused. Volkov was there. He's in federal custody. Elena absorbed this. It's over, she said. That part of it? Yes. She looked at the wall across from her. Painted concrete, institutional beige, the specific anonymous surface of a space that prioritized function over everything else. She felt exhausted in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel, while there was still something requiring management. The exhaustion had a physical address, behind her sternum, in her shoulders, in the hands that she held wrapped around the coffee cup to give them somewhere to be. Caruso, she said. His daughter starts a new treatment program next month, legitimate, at Northwestern. He paused. I made arrangements. You didn't have to. I know. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his own coffee cup with the expression of a man reviewing a long list of decisions and assessing which ones he'd stand behind in daylight. What happens to him? He goes somewhere quiet with his family and spends the next several years being grateful that I'm not the kind of man who answers betrayal with proportional force. A pause. I'm not, in this instance, for specific reasons. What reasons? He looked at her. He did what he did because he was trying to save his daughter's life. I understand that motivation even when I can't endorse the action. He paused. And you would never forgive me if I handled it differently. Elena looked at him for a long moment. You don't know that. I know enough, he said, and it was the same thing he'd said in the hospital corridor 4 weeks ago, the same words, but they had a different weight now. Not presumption. Accuracy. She looked back at the wall. I need to rebuild my life, she said. My actual life. Not the emergency version. She paused. My name is Elena Marsh. It was always Elena Marsh. I want to use it again. All right. I want to go back to work at Mercy General, my actual position, under my actual name. I can facilitate. I don't want facilitation. I want to do it myself. She turned to look at him. Whatever you can do to make sure the administrative path is clear and no one is in it, fine. But I sign the forms. I make the call to HR. I walked back through that door on my own. He nodded once. Yes. And I want to run the clinic, she said. The one you mentioned, the one providing trauma care for civilians caught in the crossfire. She held his gaze. Properly. With actual medical staff, actual protocols, actual supply chains that don't depend on someone knowing someone. I'll build it the way it should be built. That will require funding. I know where the funding comes from. I'm not naive about what it is or where it originates. She paused. I'm choosing to use it for this. That's my choice to make. Yes, he said. It is. The corridor was quiet. Some deeper in the clinic, a door opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a building doing its ordinary work. What do you want? Elena said. He looked at her. Not tactically, not operationally. She held his gaze. What do you actually want? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Not because he was evading, but because she thought he might genuinely be encountering the question as if for the first time, the way you encountered a room in a house you'd lived in for years that you'd somehow never opened. I want the thing I've been running without, he said finally. For a long time. He looked at the coffee cup. I'm not certain I know what to do with it once I have it. Neither do I, she said. We could figure it out at a pace that doesn't involve anyone trying to shoot either of us. Something happened in his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But the closest adjacent thing, the expression that lived in the same county as a smile and was more honest for not being the whole thing. That's a reasonable parameter, he said. What? 3 weeks later, Elena Marsh walked back through the doors of Mercy General under her own name. She had filled out the forms herself, in her own handwriting, with the pen she'd kept in her locker for 11 months under the name Elena Voss. She had called HR from her own phone. She had explained nothing beyond what the forms required, and the HR coordinator, a tired, thorough woman named Patricia, who had processed enough personnel actions to have lost interest in the stories behind them, had processed her paperwork with the efficient disinterest of someone doing a job well and nothing more. The walk from the parking structure to the ER entrance took 4 minutes. She did it without checking over her shoulder. She did it once in the early morning light of a December day, with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her medical bag over her shoulder, and the cold air off the lake was sharp enough to make her eyes water slightly, which she attributed to the temperature and let stand. The ER was already moving when she came through. 2 incoming cases from overnight, a triage backlog. Her colleague Denise at the nurse's station looked up, looked down, then looked up again with the double take of someone reconciling a familiar face with an unfamiliar name on the badge. Elena Marsh, Denise said. Long story, Elena said. You look different. Elena thought about this. I feel different, she said, which was true and also more than she intended to say. So she picked up the first chart and let the work begin. The clinic opened 6 weeks after that. It occupied the ground floor of a building in Pilsen, 2 blocks from the apartment she'd left in a hurry, which she had chosen deliberately, not as sentimentality, but as a specific private act of reclamation. The building had a new coat of paint on the exterior and new locks on the doors, and a sign above the entrance that said nothing about who funded it and everything about what it was for. She hired 3 nurses, 2 physicians with flexible schedules, and a woman named Grace, who had retired from social work 2 years earlier and came back for this because, as she put it, Retirement had turned out to be less of an achievement than advertised. The first week they treated 14 people. The second week, 22. By the end of the first month, she had a waiting list and a supply problem and a staffing question she hadn't fully solved, and she went to bed exhausted every night and woke up in the morning already running the day's logistics. And it was the most alive she had felt in 2 years. Lucian came to the clinic on a Tuesday in the fourth week. Not officially. He didn't make appointments, and he didn't announce himself. He appeared at the back entrance at 7 in the evening, when the last patient of the day had gone, and Grace was locking the front, and Elena found him in the corridor looking at the bulletin board she'd put up. Photographs of the space during construction, a staff schedule, a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood showing walk-in routes from 4 directions. He was looking at the map. "You drew this yourself," he said. "Grace's handwriting is terrible." "It's good." He studied it for a moment. "The north route goes past the Brennan building." "I know, I checked. The Brennan building is currently unoccupied and has no sight lines into the clinic entrance." He turned to look at her. "You checked sight lines." "Old habit." She crossed her arms and leaned against the door frame. "How is Marco?" "Recovering. He'll be back to full capacity in 6 weeks." He paused. "He asked about you." "Tell him I expect him to follow his discharge instructions." "I'll tell him." Lucien's eyes moved around the corridor, the clean walls, the supply cabinet she'd organized with the same systematic attention she'd applied to her bathroom kit, the framed prints she'd chosen because they were calming without being condescending. "You built this fast." "I had help. The funding." "The funding," she agreed. Neither of them said anything else about it. They'd had the version of this conversation that needed to happen. She'd looked at the numbers. She'd understood their origin. She'd made her choice with clear eyes. And the subject had the clean, resolved quality of something fully addressed. "Solis's case goes to grand jury in March," Lucian said. "Volkov's attorneys are already negotiating. It'll take time." "Does it involve you?" "Peripherally. Nothing that touches anything I haven't already managed." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you there's no risk. There's always risk. But the specific acute risk, the kind we've been operating inside for the last 2 months, that's gone." Elena nodded. She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had learned through specific and costly experience the difference between his managed answers and his honest ones, and this was the honest voice. "I want to show you something," she said. She led him to the far end of the corridor through a door into a small room she hadn't shown anyone yet. It was going to be a quiet room, not a medical room, not a treatment space. Just a room with decent light and 2 chairs and a table, where someone who'd just been through something could sit for a while before going back into the world. She hadn't finished it. There was a lamp in the corner, and one of the chairs was in place, and the other was still leaning against the wall. She picked up the second chair, set it across from the first. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. The lamp in the corner put warm light on both of them, and the clinic was quiet around them. And outside, the December city moved through its own business without reference to either of them. She looked at him. He had a scar along his left jaw that hadn't been there before the night he'd come through her window. Or maybe it had. She hadn't seen his face clearly until the bathroom light. The sutured side of his abdomen was fully healed. She knew this because she'd checked it twice in the last 6 weeks, and it had progressed exactly as it should. He sat in the chair with the contained, compressed stillness she'd first read his armor and had since come to understand was just the shape of him, the physical expression of a man who had learned very young that stillness was safer than motion and had never entirely unlearned it. He was looking at her with the unmanaged expression, the one that didn't have layers. "I don't know how to do this," he said. He meant it specifically, and she understood what he meant. "I know how to do a great many things. This is not one of them." "I know how to do very little at this point," she said. "I know how to run a trauma bay and install a window latch and recognize when someone is lying to me by the way they hold their hands." She paused. "The rest I'm relearning." "We could do that at the same time," he said. "We already are," she said. Outside the city, the lake, 3 miles east, moving through its winter rhythms, cold and indifferent and enormous and unchanged by anything that had happened in the last 2 months, the way large things were. Inside the clinic, the lamp, 2 chairs set across from each other in a room that was built for people who needed somewhere to sit after surviving something. Elena Marsh looked at Lucian Moretti and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular quality of a present moment that was not also an escape route, not also a contingency, not also a place she was only standing in temporarily while she figured out where it was safe to go. Just a room, just 2 people, just the long unfinished work of learning how to exist without the emergency as a structure. It was not comfort, not yet. It was the thing that came before comfort, the moment you realized the emergency was actually over and your hands had finally, quietly, stopped shaking. She sat with that. He sat across from her. The lamp held its small, steady light, and outside the city went on as cities do, without drama or conclusion, block by block and breath by breath, into whatever came next. The clinic's last light went off at 9 that night. Elena locked the front door herself, the way she locked it every evening. Deadbolt first, then the secondary, then a brief moment with her hand flat against the wood that had nothing to do with checking the mechanism and everything to do with the specific satisfaction of a thing that was hers, fully and without condition. Lucien was waiting on the sidewalk, not because she'd asked him to, not because the situation required it, just because he was, the way he'd been present for 2 months in various forms, first invisible, then unavoidable, then something she'd stopped categorizing and started simply accepting as part of the landscape of her days. They walked north toward the lake. Neither of them spoke for the first 2 blocks, which had stopped being awkward somewhere in the last several weeks and become instead its own kind of language. The particular fluency of 2 people who had survived something together and no longer needed to fill the silence to prove they were still there. The lake appeared at the end of the street, black and cold and enormous, exactly as it always was. Elena stopped at the railing. She thought about the night she'd heard him come through the window, the sound of wet fabric against her kitchen floor, the calculation she'd run. Threat or crisis, threat or crisis, and the choice she'd made without fully understanding what it would cost or what it would eventually build. She hadn't saved him because she was brave. She'd saved him because the men at the door didn't feel like protection, and she'd spent enough time on the wrong side of that distinction to recognize it instantly. Everything that followed had come from that one unplanned moment. 14 months of fear, 6 weeks of operational chaos, 2 months of slow, imperfect reconstruction, all of it tracing back to a bent window latch and a woman who was too exhausted and too angry to make the easier choice. She didn't regret it. Lucian stood beside her at the railing, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold air off the water, not touching, not needing to. Marco followed his discharge instructions, he said. I know, he came by the clinic yesterday. A pause. He brought you something. Flowers. They were slightly crushed. She looked at the lake. I put them in the quiet room. Lucien was quiet for a moment, then, You built a good thing. We're building it, she said. It's not done. No, he agreed. It isn't. The water moved below them, indifferent and continuous. The city held its noise at a distance. Elena Marsh stood at the railing under her own name, in her own life, with her hands resting easy on the cold iron, and breathed the winter air in and let it go. Not healed. She still wasn't using that word, but standing, upright, present tense. That was enough. That for now